You can make $5,000 a month and still be almost completely broke. And the weird part? You don't have to be irresponsible. You don't need a Lamborghini. You don't need to eat at expensive restaurants every night. Sometimes, all it takes is spending a little more every time your income goes up. That's exactly what happened to John. A few years ago, John made about $3,000 a month. Money was tight, but he was doing okay. He rented a small apartment, he drove an old car, he cooked at home, and he tried not to buy things he couldn't really afford. John even had a small amount of savings. He wasn't rich, but he felt like he was in control. Then, everything changed. John got a raise. His income went from $3,000 to $5,000 a month, and his first thought was simple. Finally, I can actually live a little. John wasn't planning to do anything crazy. He just wanted to make his life a little better. So he moved into a nicer apartment. He used to pay $900 in rent. Now he was paying $1,400. That's $500 more. But John wasn't worried. He had just gotten a $2,000 raise. Then his old car started breaking down. One repair, then another, then another. Eventually, John thought, that's it. I'm getting a new car. His old car cost him around $300 a month. The new one? About $700. Another $400 gone every month. But again, John didn't see a big problem. He was still making much more money than before. Then came the new phone, a new laptop, a few subscriptions, more takeout, slightly more expensive clothes, a couple of trips, and every decision seemed reasonable. A new phone? I work hard. Dinner at a restaurant? I deserve it. A vacation? I can't save every dollar forever. And honestly, none of those things were terrible on their own. That was the problem. All of those little upgrades were happening at the same time. John didn't wake up one morning and decide, today, I'm going to become terrible with money. No, his expenses just slowly started rising along with his income. This is called lifestyle inflation. Basically, you start making more money and slowly start spending more money too. Let's say John used to make $3,000 a month. After his basic expenses, maybe he had $300 left. Now, he makes $5,000. If his spending stayed roughly the same, he could have a lot more money left over. But that didn't happen. His income went up, and his lifestyle went up with it. And that's where the trap begins. When people get a raise, they often think, now I can afford this. And technically, they can. But there's a huge difference between I can afford this and I should spend my money on this. John could afford a $1,400 apartment, but could he comfortably afford that apartment? A new car, more restaurants, vacations, subscriptions, and everything else at the same time? That's a different question. And John started noticing something else. He was barely saving any money anymore. Every month, his paycheck came in. Every month, he paid his bills. And somehow, every month, the money disappeared. But John didn't feel broke. Actually, he felt like he was doing better than ever. He had a nicer apartment, a better car, a new phone. He could eat at restaurants sometimes. He could afford a vacation. On paper, everything looked great, except for one thing. He barely had any savings. One night, John opened his banking app. He expected to see a few $1,000s. Instead, his balance was $612. John stared at the screen. Then, he checked it again. He made $5,000 every month. So where was all the money going? That's when John decided to do something he hadn't done in a long time. He stopped looking at his paycheck and started looking at his spending. And what he saw next made him think. Because the problem wasn't one huge purchase. It was hidden inside dozens of small decisions. And John was just beginning to realize how expensive his new lifestyle had actually become. John opened his credit card statement and started going through it line by line. $18 for a subscription, $47 on food delivery, $32 on coffee and snacks, $89 for another purchase he could barely remember. Then another subscription, another restaurant, another random purchase. None of it looked disastrous, but together, it added up to a serious amount of money. And that's when John realized the real problem. He had been looking at his expenses one at a time. Instead, he needed to look at them as a whole. $40 doesn't feel like a big deal, neither does $60. $100? Well, things happen. But when you have dozens of expenses like that every month, they can completely change your financial situation. And this becomes especially dangerous after getting a raise, because people start asking, "Can I afford this?" instead of, "How much am I actually spending?" Those are two very different questions. Think about John. He makes more money, he sees a new car, the payment is $700 a month, and he thinks, "I can afford $700. But he forgets to ask, do I want to give up $700 every month for the next few years? That's where the real cost comes in. Because the price of something isn't always the number on the sticker. A $40,000 car isn't just $40,000. There's interest on the loan, insurance, gas, maintenance, registration, repairs, and most importantly, there's the money John can't use for something else anymore. That's called opportunity cost. Basically, when you spend money on one thing, you give up the opportunity to use that money somewhere else. For John, that $700 monthly car payment isn't just a car payment. It's $700 that isn't going toward his savings. It isn't building his emergency fund. It isn't helping him pay off debt. And it isn't available for other goals. That's when John started looking at money differently. Before, he asked, "Can I afford this?" Now he started asking, "What am I giving up if I buy this?" It's a small question, but it can completely change the way you make financial decisions. John also realized something else. The problem wasn't necessarily that he didn't make enough money. Not yet, anyway. The problem was that his spending automatically adjusted to his new income. When he made $3,000, he lived on $3,000. When he started making $5,000, he started living like $5,000 was the new minimum. And that's incredibly easy to do. You get a raise, nicer apartment, new car, more restaurants, more shopping. Then you get another raise, and it happens all over again. Eventually, someone can make twice as much money and still feel just as broke. So John decided to run a little experiment. The next month, he wasn't going to completely change his life. He just wasn't going to upgrade it again. No new car, no expensive new subscriptions, no random purchases just because he could afford them now. Instead, he automatically moved part of his extra income into a separate savings account. At first, the amount seemed small, $200, then $300, then more. And the most interesting change wasn't even happening in his bank account. It was happening in the way he felt about money. For the first time in a long time, John didn't feel like he needed his next paycheck just to make it to the next one. He had a cushion, and with that cushion came something much more valuable: freedom. Now, when his car suddenly needed a repair, John didn't think, "How am I going to pay for this?" He thought, "Okay, I've got money for this." And that's when John understood something simple. Financial freedom doesn't necessarily start with a huge salary. It starts with the gap between how much you make and how much you need to spend. If John makes $5,000 and spends $5,000, his big paycheck doesn't make him financially free. But if he makes $5,000 and slowly learns to live on $4,000, now he has room. That room can become savings, investments, money to start a business, protection if he loses his job, or simply peace of mind. John didn't become rich overnight. He just stopped treating every raise like permission to spend more. And that changed the way he looked at money. Because the real problem wasn't that John made too little. He had simply gotten used to having more too quickly. And maybe that's why one of the best questions you can ask yourself after your next raise is, how much of this extra income do I actually want to spend? Not, what else can I afford now? And next time, John has a new problem. He suddenly has $10,000. Should he buy a car, save it, invest it, or do something completely different? If you want to see what John does, subscribe, leave a like, and tell me in the comments what you would do with $10,000. See you in the next one.